The streets of Asheville were supposed to welcome him home with warmth and peace. Yet when Sergeant Silas Bennett pushed open his front door with Rex, his loyal German shepherd, padding at his side, the silence was unbearable. In the dim kitchen light, two little girls in torn pink dresses stood on a chair, trying to stir a pot of noodles far too heavy for their small hands. Their eyes were red, their cheeks streaked with tears, and when one finally looked up at him, she whispered a word that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. "Daddy." In that moment, Silas knew the greatest fight of his life wasn't in the desert he'd left behind. It was in this house, and the truth it was hiding. The word daddy still echoed in Silas Bennett's mind long after it had been spoken. He stood at the threshold of his own home in Asheville, North Carolina, the bouquet of flowers he had bought at the airport hanging loosely in one hand, his chest constricting with an unfamiliar kind of dread. He had expected laughter, the running footsteps of children, the warm embrace of his wife, and the smell of supper rising from the kitchen. Instead, what greeted him was the dim, pale glow of a single bulb, the clatter of dishes far too heavy for small arms, and the sight of two frail figures balancing on a wooden chair by the sink. Clara and Lily, his twin daughters, were only 7. Yet in that moment they seemed older children who had learned to carry burdens no child should bear. Their torn pink dresses, once bright, now hung off their thin shoulders like tired flags. Strands of tangled blonde hair clung to their damp cheeks. Clara, the slightly taller of the two, stirred a pot with a spoon far too long for her grasp, while Lily leaned against her, clutching the counter to steady herself. The steam from the pot curled weakly into the air, smelling faintly of overcooked noodles and a kind of desperation that no meal should carry. At Silas's side stood Valor, the German shepherd who had followed him through sandstorms, firefights, and endless nights of uncertainty. Valor's coat, a mix of sable and black, gleamed faintly even in the dull light, his amber eyes alert but soft. In the service, Valor had been trained for discipline, detection, and survival. Yet here, his instincts shifted seamlessly into gentleness. He padded forward slowly, lowering his head, his tail swaying in a calm rhythm as though to tell the girls that this house might be broken, but he was not. He would protect them. Silas cleared his throat, though his voice came out softer than he intended. "Clara, Lily." The twins froze. Clara's spoon clattered against the pot, and Lily's hand tightened on the counter until her knuckles turned white. Slowly they turned, and when their wide, red-rimmed eyes met his, neither ran into his arms as he had dreamed for months on end. Instead, they blinked at him like he was a ghost, someone they had prayed for but feared to believe would return. Valor, sensing their hesitation, closed the space. He pressed his nose gently into Lily's small hand, and the child gasped before letting out a shaky giggle. Clara followed, tentative at first, her tiny fingers brushing through Valor's thick fur. That was enough to break the fragile silence. The girls began to sob, not with fear, but with a release of something they had held back for too long. Valor leaned against them, steady as a wall, while Silas stood rooted, torn between the urge to sweep them up in his arms and the fear that doing so would only shatter what little fragile trust remained. He finally knelt, placing the flowers on the floor. "It's me. I'm home. I've missed you both more than you'll ever know." His voice cracked despite years of training to keep it steady. Clara wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. You really came back." "I promised I would, didn't I?" Silas whispered. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to pause. The house, the air, the ache in his chest. But then reality pushed its way back in. He looked around. The living room rug was askew, the television remote abandoned like someone had dropped it mid-argument. The front door had been unlocked. On the wall just beyond the hallway, long scratches marred the paint, jagged and raw. He rose slowly, scanning the space with a soldier's instinct sharpened by years of war. Something wasn't right. His family home, the place he had held on to as a beacon during endless nights overseas, felt foreign. It no longer held warmth. Instead, it smelled of neglect, silence, and secrets. "Where's your mom?" Silas asked gently, forcing calm into his tone. Clara and Lily exchanged glances. Lily lowered her eyes to the floor, while Clara whispered, She went out. Out. That was all. No time, no explanation. Silas's chest tightened, but he swallowed his questions. He had spent 2 years commanding men, giving orders, surviving in deserts where every mistake cost lives. But here, in front of his daughters, he found his voice caught. The battlefield had taught him many things, but not how to ask why two little girls were cooking dinner alone. He turned to the pot. The noodles had swollen and clumped together. The broth nearly boiled away. He reached over, shutting off the burner before it burned. "You don't have to cook alone anymore," he murmured, more to himself than to them. Valor circled back to Silas's side, brushing against his leg as if grounding him. The dog's calm presence reminded Silas of nights in the desert when the only sound had been the rasp of the wind and Valor's steady breathing. Back then, Silas had told himself that as long as the dog lived, so would he. Now watching his daughters cling to Valor as though he were the only safe thing in the room, he realized that the same truth applied here. Silas reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He dialed Abigail, his wife. 3 rings, 4, then voicemail. He hung up, tried again. Nothing. He typed a short message. "I'm home. Where are you?" Silence. Another message. "Urgent. Call me back." Still nothing. His pulse hammered in his temples. He looked down at Clara and Lily again. Clara was pressing her lips together, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress until the fabric bunched. Lily leaned against Valor, eyes half closed, as though the dog's steady heartbeat was the only thing keeping her grounded. Silas crouched. "Have you eaten yet?" Lily pointed to the pot. "We made noodles." He nodded. His throat ached, but he forced a smile. "All right then. Let's eat together." The 3 of them sat at the table. Silas scooped the noodles into bowls, dividing them evenly. He had survived on military rations and sand-scorched bread, but never had food tasted so flat. The silence between him and his daughters pressed heavier than the war he had left behind. He tried again. "Did your mom say when she'd be back?" Clara shook her head. Lily whispered, "She goes out a lot." Then she quickly clamped her mouth shut, as if afraid she had already said too much. Valor lay at their feet, ears pricked, eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. The dog's unease mirrored Silas's own. After dinner, Clara carefully stacked the bowls by the sink. She pushed the chair back against the wall with exaggerated care, making sure its legs didn't scrape the floor. Silas frowned. No child moved like that unless they had been taught to fear the sound of noise. He wanted to ask. He wanted to demand answers. But he remembered the trembling in their shoulders when they first saw him, the way they had flinched before Valor calmed them. He couldn't press too hard, not yet. Not until he knew how deep the damage ran. Later, when he tucked them into their beds with thin sheets and threadbare blankets, he stood in the doorway longer than necessary. Clara clutched a stuffed rabbit missing an ear. Lily curled against her sister's back, their breaths shallow but sinking as sleep pulled them under. Valor lay on the floor beside them, his head on his paws, but his eyes never closed. Silas whispered into the dimness, "I'm here now, and nothing's going to hurt you again." The house gave no answer, only the groan of the old beams and the whisper of the wind through unlatched windows. But deep inside, Silas knew his instincts were rarely wrong. Something had carved fear into his daughter's small frames. Something had changed his wife. And though he didn't yet have the pieces, the battlefield inside his own home had already begun. The following morning dawned gray over Asheville, the kind of damp chill that clung to the bones and lingered in the corners of a quiet street. Silas rose early, as habit had trained him, though he had hardly slept. The faint creak of the old house and the sound of his daughter's shallow breathing behind their closed door had kept him awake. Valor had not left his post, curled at the foot of the hallway, with his ears twitching at every faint noise. The dog's silent vigilance reminded Silas of nights spent in desert outposts, where danger was invisible, but never absent. When Silas stepped into the kitchen, Clara and Lily were already there. Clara, taller by half an inch and often taking the lead, poured cereal into chip bowls with deliberate movements, as though performing a ritual. Lily clung to her sister's arm, her eyes still swollen from sleep, her bare feet making soft prints on the cold linoleum. Silas tried to smile, but the lines around his eyes betrayed him. "Morning," he said gently. Clara murmured back, "Morning, Daddy," though her voice trembled on the last word as though still unaccustomed to it. He sat with them, pouring milk from a nearly empty carton. "Your mom didn't come home last night?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Lily's spoon clinked against the bowl. "She goes with someone," she whispered, then stopped, darting a look at her sister, as if she had already said too much. Clara pressed her lips tight, but finally nodded. "His name is Victor." "Victor Hale. He comes a lot." The name hit Silas like the crack of a rifle. He forced his hand steady around his cup. "Who is Victor?" Clara lowered her gaze. "He's tall, shaved hair. He's not nice. He tells us to be quiet. Sometimes he takes Mom out and leaves us here." Before Silas could press further, Valor stirred from his place near the back door. The dog's hackles lifted, nose low to the ground. He padded into the living room, ears pricked. Silas followed, the weight in his chest tightening. On the carpet just inside the door, dark streaks marred the fibers, mud drying but fresh enough to leave a faint dampness. Beside them were faint impressions of boots, larger than his own. Valor growled softly, then turned toward the corner where a small black dome peeked from the ceiling. One of the security cameras Silas had installed before deployment. The dog barked once, short and sharp, as though insisting his master look closer. Silas crouched, fingers grazing the muddy imprint. He rose, strode to the cabinet, and retrieved the small monitor connected to the cameras. The screen flickered to life, the grainy footage rolling back hours. Midnight. The front door creaked open. Abigail entered, her blonde hair tucked beneath a hood, her slender frame wrapped in a long coat. Behind her, a man followed, Victor Hale. He was perhaps in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his head shaved close to the scalp, his jaw perpetually clenched. Even through the black and white footage, his presence radiated dominance. His scowl was not just expression, but habit, etched into his face by years of choosing control over kindness. Abigail glanced back once, then moved into the kitchen, setting her purse on the counter. Victor trailed behind, pausing to look around the living room, as if appraising something he might one day claim. The twins were nowhere in sight. Silas's stomach turned as the man's lips moved. No audio, but his gestures sharp, a finger stabbing toward the hallway. Abigail crossed her arms and said nothing. Minutes later, the two left again, the front door swinging shut behind them, leaving only silence in their wake. Silas's knuckles whitened around the monitor. His wife, once the woman who had promised to keep their home warm in his absence, now walked with another man while his daughter sat in loneliness. And worse, she let that man step inside the very walls Silas had fought to return to. A knock startled him from the spiral of rage. He opened the front door to find Martha Green, the neighbor from 2 houses down. Martha was in her early 60s, her frame short but sturdy, her graying hair tied into a bun beneath a faded scarf. She had the air of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by hardship, yet too kind to ignore it. She carried a basket of muffins, though her eyes held only worry. "Jamie? Oh, forgive me, Silas," she corrected herself, remembering the name he had once told her before deployment. "You're back." "I am," Silas said cautiously, "and I suppose you know already that Abigail isn't here." Martha sighed, glancing down at her hands. "I didn't want to meddle, but I've heard things. That man, Victor, he comes around often. The girls." Her voice softened. "One night I heard him shouting from your house. Said if they made their mother upset, he'd lock them in a dark room. I've raised children of my own. That's no way to speak to little ones." The words stung worse than shrapnel. Silas clenched his jaw, steadying himself. He thanked her for the muffins, though both knew the food was only a pretext to share the truth. Martha's face softened with sympathy. "You've been through war, son. But don't think it ended over there. Sometimes the hardest battles are waiting right at home." When she left, Silas closed the door and leaned against it, the basket untouched. His daughters peeked from the hallway, Valor standing like a sentinel between them. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Is Mom coming back?" Silas forced himself upright, his voice calm. "She will. But until then, You have me. And Valor. The dog wagged his tail once, stepping closer to the girls, his presence reassuring. Later that evening, Silas sat alone in the living room, the glow of the monitor flickering across his face. The footage repeated in endless loops, Abigail walking with Victor, Victor's scowl, the girl's absence from the screen. Valor lay at his feet, chin on his paws but eyes open, ever alert. Silas knew those eyes had stared into the darkest corners of the battlefield with him, had once dragged him from debris after an explosion. And now they bore witness again, not to gunfire but to betrayal. The weight pressed heavy on Silas's chest. In the service, he had always known his enemy, could measure distance, gauge risk, decide action. Here in his own home, the enemy was not marked by uniform or flag. It was silence, neglect, and a man with a scowl who dared to call himself a presence in his daughter's lives. He reached down, resting a hand on Valor's head. "We've walked through worse," he muttered, "and we'll walk through this." Night fell early over Asheville, draping the neighborhood in shadows before the clock had even reached 7. A soft drizzle tapped against the window panes, turning the world beyond into a blur of street lamps and slick asphalt. Inside the Bennett house, the air was heavy, as though silence itself had thickened. Silas sat at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him, his thoughts circling the footage he had seen the night before. Valor lay stretched across the threshold, ears pricked, every sense alert though his body appeared relaxed. He was never truly at rest. Silas had learned that in the desert, and now his daughters were learning it too. The twins lingered in the living room, whispering to each other. Clara, the braver of the two, finally walked over clutching a stuffed bear so worn it had lost an eye and much of its fur. Her small frame trembled despite the warmth of the heater, her fingers digging into the toy as though it could anchor her. She climbed onto a chair beside Silas, her legs dangling, and leaned into his side. Lily followed moments later, quieter and more hesitant, her pale face half hidden by her tangled hair. Clara pressed the bear against her chest. "Daddy," she whispered, voice unsteady, "I need to tell you something." Silas turned, his heart already bracing for whatever truth she carried. Her lips trembled as she continued. "Victor, he stepped on my bear. He laughed when I cried. He said if we ever made Mom upset again, he'd take away our light." Silas frowned, his gaze dropping to the small lamp glowing faintly in the corner of the room, the only source of comfort the girls insisted on at night. "What light, sweetheart?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "The night lamp. He said he'd break it. He said we didn't deserve even that if we weren't quiet." The words struck Silas harder than any enemy bullet ever had. He reached out, drawing both Clara and Lily into his arms. They clung to him desperately, as if afraid he might vanish again. He swallowed his rage, forcing his voice steady. "Listen to me. No one will take your light. Not while I'm here. I swear to you both, you'll be safe now." Valor rose silently, padding closer to the girls. He lowered his head, resting it gently against Clara's knee. The steady weight of his presence pulled a shaky giggle from Lily, who stroked the dog's thick fur. To the twins, Valor was not just a dog, but a wall of protection, and they leaned against him as though he were part of the family's foundation. That night, Silas tucked the girls into bed earlier than usual, drawing the thin blankets up to their chins. Clara's bear rested beside her, its missing eye turned to the wall. The night lamp cast a soft glow, painting the ceiling with faint golden light. Valor positioned himself by the door, his body blocking the entrance, his ears angled toward every creak and sigh of the old house. Silas lingered in the hallway, watching the scene. It was not a battlefield in the traditional sense, yet the tension in his chest was the same. He retreated to the living room, pulling out his phone. His fingers hesitated over the contacts before selecting a name he had not called in years. Ben Carter. Ben had once been his squad mate, a man who had navigated the same desert roads and firefights. Now at 38, Ben served as a detective in Asheville's police department. He had the build of a man who never quite left the field behind, broad shoulders, close-cropped hair graying at the temples, eyes sharp and unreadable. Years of service had carved him into someone who distrusted smiles, preferring facts over promises. When Silas explained in a low voice what he had discovered, Ben was silent for a long while before answering. "Victor Hale," he finally said. The name's familiar. Give me some time. His voice carried that clipped precision Silas remembered from years past, the tone of a man who delivered only what he was certain of. The following afternoon, Ben appeared at Silas's door. He wore a plain gray suit that did little to hide his military bearing, his badge clipped to his belt, but partially concealed by his jacket. His expression was grim. "You were right to call me." Inside, while the twins colored quietly at the table under Valor's watchful eye, Ben laid out what he had uncovered. Victor Hale, age 42, history of domestic disputes. None that ever went to trial, but enough to paint a pattern. He's been tied to 2 failed businesses, both shut down under suspicion of fraud. Nothing stuck, but his name keeps popping up in reports connected to low-level racketeering. He moves money through small real estate flips, always just under the radar. Silas listened, his jaw tightening with every word. Ben leaned forward, lowering his voice. Men like him survive by intimidation. They don't raise fists in public. They whisper threats in kitchens and leave just enough fear behind to control everything. And if Abigail's tied up with him, whether by choice or manipulation, you've got more than a marriage problem. You've got a predator in your house. Silas's fists clenched, but he forced himself calm. Years in the Marines had taught him that anger without strategy was suicide. So what do I do? Ben's eyes narrowed, the same way they had before breaching doors overseas. You don't take him head on. Not yet. You build your case. Witnesses, records, video. When the time comes, you'll take him down legally, and it'll stick. You fought wars with rifles. This one, you fight with evidence. Silas nodded slowly, his heart heavy but resolute. He glanced toward the kitchen where Clara and Lily sat bent over their drawings. Valor stretched between them like a living guardian. The children deserved more than survival. They deserved peace. That night, Silas sat awake long after the girls had fallen asleep. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. The house creaked as though unsettled by the truce it now held. In the faint light, Valor remained at his post by the girls' door, eyes gleaming whenever the shadows shifted. Silas knew the dog would not move, not even for hunger or sleep. He was a soldier too, and his war was to keep 2 children safe through the night. Silas leaned back, exhaustion tugging at him, but resolve keeping him steady. His daughters had finally spoken. The battle lines were clear, and for the first time, he understood that the greatest war he would ever fight was not the one waged overseas, but the one unfolding quietly within the walls of his own home. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a sky of dull slate, the kind of morning that pressed down on the shoulders of everyone who walked beneath it. Silas Bennett stood outside the Buncombe County Courthouse in Asheville, the building's stone columns rising stark against the gray clouds. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite hide the soldier in him, his shoulders squared, his back rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Beside him stood Valor, his German shepherd, not officially allowed inside but permitted to wait quietly near the steps thanks to the intervention of Ben Carter. The dog's calm, watchful presence steadied Silas as much as any weapon once had. Clara and Lily clung to his hands, each in a plain dress borrowed from Martha Green, their hair brushed neatly, though their faces still carried the thinness of children who had endured too many lonely nights. They said little, but their grip told him enough. They trusted him. Inside the courthouse, Abigail arrived moments later. She was 37, striking in her way tall, with golden hair styled meticulously, her face touched with makeup that masked exhaustion, but could not erase the faint lines of bitterness around her mouth. At her side was Victor Hale. In the daylight, his presence seemed more menacing than in grainy footage. 6'2", broad, his dark eyes sharp under a shaved scalp, his fitted suit failing to disguise the air of intimidation that clung to him like smoke. He did not sit beside Abigail, but just behind her, a shadow at her shoulder, whispering into her ear with the casual authority of someone pulling invisible strings. The judge, an older man named Harold Whitmore, presided with the steady patience of someone who had seen every flavor of human failure. In his late 60s, with thinning white hair and glasses perched low on his nose, he was known for his measured tone and intolerance for theatrics. Today his gaze swept over both sides with equal weight, and the gavel's strike silenced the room. Abigail's attorney, a polished woman named Rebecca Lowell, began with a carefully crafted narrative. She painted Silas as a man absent for 2 years, a father who had abandoned his daughters to the care of their mother, leaving her with the crushing burden of responsibility. Rebecca's words flowed with the precision of a sculptor, every phrase designed to frame Abigail as the victim of neglect. She spoke of emotional strain, of children needing stability, of a husband whose sense of duty to his country had eclipsed his duty to his home. Abigail dabbed theatrically at her eyes with a tissue, while Victor leaned back with a faint smirk. Silas listened in silence, his jaw tight, his hands folded. He had learned long ago that the battlefield required patience. Sometimes you waited until the enemy had fully exposed himself before you struck. His attorney, Daniel Ross, was a man in his 40s with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, known for his methodical style rather than dramatic speeches. When Rebecca finished, Daniel rose slowly, adjusting his tie, his voice calm. "Your Honor, we would like to present evidence before any counter-arguments." The judge nodded, and the first exhibit appeared on the screen. Footage from the Bennett home. The room fell quiet as the grainy images played. Victor loomed large on the screen, his mouth moving in sharp words, his hand snatching a stuffed bear from Clara before stomping on it. His finger jabbed toward the children, his gestures unmistakably threatening. Abigail stood nearby, her arms crossed, her face cold, making no effort to intervene. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge lifted a hand for silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharper now. Abigail shifted in her seat, her lips pressed tightly while Victor's jaw tensed. Daniel continued, calling Martha Green to the stand. Martha, in her 60s, carried herself with dignity despite her nervous hands. She described nights when she had heard shouting from the Bennett home, threats to the children, the sight of Abigail leaving with Victor while the kitchen light burned late into the night. Her voice cracked once, but held steady, her sincerity impossible to ignore. Next came Mr. Tom Avery, the neighbor across the street, a man in his 50s with a weathered face from years of outdoor work. He confirmed he had often seen Abigail leaving with Victor, leaving the girls behind. "I don't know what went on inside," he admitted, "but I saw enough to know those girls were alone more often than not." Finally, Daniel called a quiet figure forward. Emily Grant, Clara and Lily's teacher. She was in her early 30s, slender, with auburn hair tied neatly back and eyes that carried a mix of gentleness and weariness. She presented school records, notes of missed parent meetings, simple lunches packed for the girls, and occasions when Clara asked to stay after class because it wasn't convenient to do homework at home. Her testimony was not dramatic but steady, like stones placed carefully one after another until a path was clear. The tension in the courtroom deepened. Abigail fidgeted, twisting a ring on her finger. Rebecca Lowell attempted to counter, speaking of stress, of a mother overwhelmed, of children sometimes exaggerating hardships. But the rhythm of her defense faltered when Daniel quietly asked permission for one final witness. The side door opened and Clara and Lily entered, clutching each other's hands, Valor trotting softly beside them with permission from the judge. The room hushed. The girls climbed the steps to the witness bench, small and fragile beneath the towering wood, their stuffed bear tucked under Clara's arm like a shield. The judge leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "You only need to tell us the truth." Nothing more. Clara's voice trembled but carried through the still room. "Victor scares us. He says he'll take away our light." "Mom." She doesn't stop him. Lily buried her face against her sister's shoulder, but when prompted softly, she whispered, "We want to live with Daddy, because he never makes us afraid." For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Abigail's tissue hung forgotten in her hand, while Victor's smirk finally vanished. Then Daniel delivered the final blow. He projected a series of text messages recovered through Ben Carter's investigation, displayed clearly on the screen. The messages showed Victor urging Abigail to claim neglect, to exaggerate, to win custody and secure financial support. One line read bluntly, "Say he abandoned you and the kids. Don't waver. We'll get the support money." The silence in the courtroom was heavy, broken only by the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Even Rebecca Lowell faltered, her face paling as the judge's eyes bore into Abigail. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low but deliberate. "This court has heard enough for today. We will recess to deliberate. But I will say this. The best interest of the children is not served by fear." The gavel struck, the sound echoing like final judgment. Silas gathered his daughters into his arms as Valor pressed close, his warm body shielding them from the sea of eyes. Abigail remained seated, frozen, while Victor leaned toward her, his whisper sharp and poisonous. But in that moment, Silas knew the tide had turned. The truth had been spoken aloud, and the weight of it would not be silenced. The verdict did not echo in a single moment, but settled slowly, like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. Victor Hale was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his heavy frame slouched for the first time, his defiance dimmed by the cold bite of steel around his wrists. He did not shout or struggle. His silence was worse, like a predator cornered at last. Abigail remained seated, her shoulders stiff, her eyes blank as the words of the judge weighed on her. Custody of Clara and Lily Bennett is granted in full to their father, Sergeant Silas Bennett. The plaintiff, Abigail Moore, is stripped of all guardianship rights until further review. Silas did not smile. There was no victory in the downfall of someone he had once loved. But when Clara and Lily pressed against his sides, small hands gripping his arms, their trembling easing for the first time, he knew this was the only outcome that mattered. Valor stood just behind them, silent but alert, his amber eyes following every movement in the courtroom. To the girls, he was their shield. To Silas, he was the unspoken reminder that loyalty and courage often came in forepaws and fur. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet work. The Bennett home, once cold and shadowed, was slowly reborn. Silas threw himself into repairs, not with the precision of a soldier, but with the determination of a father trying to build a sanctuary. The scratched walls were repainted in soft cream, the broken frames fixed, the roof patched where leaks had dripped into the living room during storms. In the twins' room, he let them choose the new wallpaper. Clara pointed at a design covered in drifting clouds, while Lily chose one speckled with golden stars. Together, they layered the walls with sky and starlight, their laughter returning in bursts as tape and brushes smeared paint across their fingertips. Valor remained ever present, padding from room to room, lying across doorways like a sentinel. At night, he curled outside the girls' bedroom door, his breathing steady, his presence heavy and comforting. Sometimes Clara would open the door quietly, crawl onto the floor and rest against him until sleep overcame her. Silas, watching from the hallway, never stopped her. Valor had been trained to save soldiers on the battlefield, but here he saved children from fear. Spring came to Asheville with shy blossoms and gentle breezes. The dogwoods bloomed white along the sidewalks, and the park near the Bennett home came alive with families and picnics. On one warm afternoon, Silas brought Clara and Lily to that park. He wore a plain shirt rolled at the sleeves, the sun catching the faint scars along his forearm, reminders of deserts far away. Clara held tightly to his hand, swinging it with childlike rhythm, while Lily clung around Valor's neck, her small arms hugging his thick fur as if she could never let go. They paused beneath a budding oak tree, sunlight spilling through its branches. Clara looked up at her father, her face glowing with certainty beyond her years. "Daddy," she whispered, "now we really have a home." The words pierced deeper than any oath. Silas's throat tightened, and he bent down to kiss the crown of her head. He did not answer, but his smile was enough. Their days found a rhythm again. Breakfast became noisy with chatter, and cereal spilled on the table. Evenings ended with stories by lamplight, Silas reading in a voice roughened by years of shouting orders, but softened now for fairy tales and bedtime prayers. The girls' drawings began to cover the refrigerator, clumsy suns, stick figures holding hands, and always Valor sketched with oversized paws and a wagging tail. Yet healing was not instant. There were nights when Lily woke crying, memories of Victor's threats slipping into her dreams. On those nights, Silas would sit by her bed, his large hands smoothing her hair until her sobs slowed. Valor lay beside the bed, growling softly at shadows only he seemed to sense. Clara, too, carried scars. Sometimes when a door slammed too hard or a voice rose unexpectedly, she would flinch and retreat behind her sister. Silas learned not to rush, but to let them come back at their own pace. Time, he realized, was its own battlefield, one where patience was the weapon. Martha Green became a constant presence, stopping by with pies or to sit on the porch with Silas while the girls played. Her wisdom carried the steady cadence of years lived with hardship. "Children bend, Silas," she told him one evening, her eyes following the twins laughing with Valor in the yard. "But if they are cared for, they bend back toward the light." Ben Carter visited often, too, sometimes bringing paperwork, sometimes just to check in. His presence reassured Silas that the fight had not been for nothing. He was a man hardened by both war and the city's darker corners. But even he softened when Clara offered him a flower she had picked from the yard. "You've got brave girls," Ben said quietly. "They've got your blood." As for Abigail, her absence hung like a distant storm. She had been ordered to counseling, her visits suspended indefinitely. Clara sometimes asked about her, the questions hesitant, the answers difficult. Silas never spoke with bitterness, only with truth. "Your mother needs help right now," he would say, "but you're safe here, and that's what matters." The girls seemed to accept that, though the shadow lingered in their eyes. One evening, as twilight settled over the house, Silas found Clara and Lily sitting on the porch steps. Valor stretched between them. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Clara leaned against her sister, whispering, "We're safe now." Lily nodded, resting her cheek against Valor's fur. Silas watched from the doorway, his heart full. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Silas stepped into the hallway. He listened to their even breaths, the quiet hum of the night lamp casting gentle patterns against the ceiling. Valor lifted his head from the floor, meeting Silas's gaze. In the soldier's eyes and the dog's, a wordless vow passed between them. The war here was over, but the watch would never end. For the first time since his return, Silas allowed himself to exhale fully, his chest loosening. The battle had cost him much, but it had given him something greater. A family restored, a home reborn, and the knowledge that courage was not only measured on foreign soil, but in the quiet defense of those who needed him most. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant fields, but in the quiet corners of our own homes. Silas and his daughters remind us that healing is possible when love, loyalty, and courage stand together. Valor may not speak, but his watchful presence proved that even silence can protect a family. What about you? Do you believe that a dog's loyalty can heal wounds that even time cannot? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, follow for more stories of hope, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next chapter.